Hello and welcome to day 2, superheroes. Thank you for continuing to help us in our battle against Dr. Greed. To continue that support, I'm now going to place in the Zoom chat, I'm going to place in there some Zoom backgrounds if you so choose to want to have those. That being said, yesterday was a very exciting day, and I wanted to recap what we have been doing or what we've been learning in some of that. And so I wanted to give you also the opportunity to share all of that great information, or one thing that maybe you had taken away if you did attend. So at this time, if you'd please also turn your attention to the chat and share with our colleagues what you had taken away or your top takeaway from yesterday. While everybody's doing that, I just want to kind of go over some of the sessions that we did have yesterday and then today's agenda while you're putting that in there. So yesterday we started off with MJ Bishop, improving access, affordability, and achievement with OER. We had an instructional designer roundtable, and we had a talk on OER basics. We also had a few institutions share on their OER for non-traditional courses, as well as an open education in promotion and tenure toolkit provided by a group of people. Today, we're starting off here with the Joy of Open Pedagogy. We also had yesterday a networking session that was very beneficial, I thought, and had some good conversation with some of our peers where they were able to get help and support in terms of some of those things. But just looking at some of the chat, there's a lot of good stuff in terms of what you're sharing. So please continue to share in the chat what you've learned there. As far as today, we have another exciting day in store for you. If you all recall Superman, it's a bird, it's a plane. It's today's keynote speaker, Heather Miceli. Dr. Heather Miceli is a lecturer at Roger Williams University in Bristol, Rhode Island, and has been teaching as a contingent faculty member at a few different institutions for the last 13 years. She had taught the undergraduate general education science courses in RWU's core curriculum for the past 7 years. As an RWU OER faculty fellow, Heather has incorporated a Renewable Open Pedagogy Project into her course that has spanned over 4 years. Students create and/or edit websites on topics relevant to their interests. She's very interested in the impacts open educational practices, open pedagogy, can have on student achievement, but also how those practices can impact students' confidence and anxiety in science courses. She's also interested in alternative assessment strategies and has been using ungrading in her courses for about 3 years now. She serves on the New England Board of Higher Education, OER Advisory Committee, and was also an OER Research Fellow with the Open Education Group from 2019 to 2020. Please go down into your emojis and please help me welcome in giving a superhero welcome to Dr. Heather Miceli.
Thank you all so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be with you today. I'm going to assume, Kyle, that everybody can see my slides and that we're ready to go. Okay, great. I am so excited to be here today. I'm going to talk about the joy of open pedagogy, because to me, it really is joyful. I'm speaking to you today from the Roger Williams University campus in Bristol, Rhode Island, which is settled on the traditional lands of the Pokanoket tribe. And today I'm going to talk, it's going to be a rather kind of personal journey in open pedagogy, very kind of different from what Dr. MJ Bishop talked about yesterday in an institutional setting. Mine is very personal and relegated to my class, but I still think that there's a lot of value in that as well. So I want to start with a quote that I relate to a lot right now. And that's the first paradigm that shaped my pedagogy was the idea that classrooms should be an exciting place, never boring. Now, it wasn't the first paradigm for me, believe me. I started teaching when I was a very young 24 years old at just finished up on a master's program. And I was a very boring teacher. But it's certainly something that I look at today. And I want my classroom to be an exciting place. I want it to not be a boring place. And I want it to be a joyful place. And so yesterday, Dr. Bishop shared a chart that was very similar to this. I couldn't find the original in the short amount of time between our presentations, but it was very similar to this. It had, like textbooks on the bottom and then teaching practices on the vertical axis. And it was really indicating that OER itself is not always transformational and that teaching practices can remain traditional even with the use of OER. She mentioned that the sweet spot on this chart is when OER and more open teaching practices intersect in the blue box that I have highlighted here. This is where I live, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to start with what I teach. I teach general education science, and I'm pretty sure that many of you, when you heard those words, it may not have sparked joy. It probably conjured images of student handbooks, curriculum mapping, advising, very precise tables illustrated for the campus website. For others, you may have traveled back in time to when you took your general education science requirement. And for a lot of people, general education science is not joyful. And for me, it wasn't always a joyful phrase either. I've always taught general education, non-major science classes for the 14 years that I've been teaching. But I didn't always love teaching the way I do now. I spent a lot of time early on in my career, I was teaching general education science to culinary students. And I did hold a pretty deficit view of their abilities as science students. And very quickly learned that that was not an approach that I needed to have in the classroom in order for my students to be successful. Eventually, I realized that I needed to shift, and I was like, okay, well, general education is usually a box that my students have to tick. So let's try to make it as painless as possible. And basically, that didn't really spark joy either, because to me, I was just kind of going through the motions of teaching the way that I had been taught, in the way that I had experienced science classes, and I was putting that same perspective onto students that were not like me, who were not science students. And so about 5 years ago, I was going through the motions. I was teaching general education science. We call it Core 101 here at Roger Williams. All of our students take Core 101. It is a required course. I taught it very traditionally. I lectured. I used some active learning activities, usually in spaces not very conducive to active learning. Yesterday, MJ showed a picture of a lecture hall and was like, this isn't a great place to do active learning. And I had to laugh because one semester I had a 25-person class in a 200-person lecture hall, and it did not work. I gave exams, I took attendance, gave participation credit. The course Core 101 is designed with very broad content objectives to encourage faculty to teach what they're passionate about. And for me, what I discovered that I was passionate about was the way in which students understand the role of science in their lives and in society. To me, that is the purpose of general education, that we want to give them that well-rounded education so that when they leave college, they've at least had some experience in the sciences and realize that science is an important part of our lives. So on top of the content that I was teaching, I had developed a project where the students worked in groups to choose a topic of their own interest, and they'd work on it over the course of the semester. They'd research it, they'd write a paper, and they'd create these posters. And we had these amazing poster sessions. These were like my most favorite class that we had. They would we would have food, we would sit down, we would talk about their work, they would share with each other. I would run around and assess them. But I was like listening in the background to the conversations that they were having with each other. And overall, we all had a very good time. This is where it could have turned into a villain origin story. To kind of stick with the theme of the superheroes, I would walk out of the room and those posters would be in the trash. Literally right outside the classroom. I'd have like this, I'd be walking on the clouds, pure joy. It was such a great class. And then I'd walk out and see all of their work just thrown away in the trash, not 10 feet from the door that we were in. And I can't blame them. They're college students. It was usually at the end of the semester. They were getting ready to go home for summer or Christmas. And I don't expect college kids to keep a trifold poster from one of their general education classes, but it definitely it hurt for a minute. And I eventually learned that these are what we call disposable assignments. And as David Wiley says here in this quote, they're really assignments that add no real value to the world. A student spends 3 hours creating it, a teacher spends 30 minutes grading it, and then the student throws away. And it really is an incredible waste of time and brain power to have all of that knowledge, all of that information just thrown away in the trash. And it was understanding the difference between disposable assignments and what could be renewable assignments, which is what I'm going to talk about here, and the concept of open pedagogy that helped me understand this. And I ended up not turning into a villain. So I'm going to talk about open pedagogy today, but if I'm going to give you 3 different definitions of open pedagogy, because when you Google open pedagogy, you aren't going to find a single definition. Depending on the source that you consult, open pedagogy might be a series of practices, it might be a learning style, or it might be a state of mind. Honestly, I've probably gone through the gamut of all of those things. It started as a series of practices, it ended up being a learning style for my students, but it really is now a state of mind for me. And I'm going to talk about kind of the progression there. But for right now, let's start with the series of practices. And I'm going to focus on it as a series of practices, which involve engaging students in a course through the development, adaptation, or use of open educational resources. And that's the definition that is in the OER starter kit that I was very own Abby Elder is an author of. To me, I was actually introduced to the concept of open pedagogy. Open Pedagogy by Rajiv Jengjiani from Kwantlen Polytechnic in British Columbia when he came to speak at Roger Williams University in the summer of 2017. I was invited to the talk as an OER faculty fellow on campus. And while I was interested in the beginning of his talk about the benefits of OER, the affordability, the access that students have to textbooks, probably a lot of the things that you went through yesterday in a lot of those introductory sessions. It was the end of his talk that focused on student-created OER that really intrigued me. He spoke about several different examples of open pedagogy, including students editing Wikipedia as assignments and creating text bank questions. But it really was this student-created textbook that caught my attention. So Environmental Science Bites is an open textbook. It's written by students in an introduction to environmental science course at The Ohio State University. And I didn't know it at the time, but it is actually that introduction to environmental science course is a general education class. But I literally wrote in big letters in the notebook that I was taking notes in, what would a science textbook for non-majors written by non-majors look like? And could I pull this off in my class? And I did. It looks like this. In my case, it's not a textbook. Our OER is a series of websites. We call it the completely unoriginal Core 101 Open Pedagogy Project because I'm terrible at coming up with titles and names. But it is a series of websites that is 100% written, edited, and curated by my students. And so I'm showing you here one of the pages that's been really popular in the past couple of years. Obviously, the vaccine page, and with the vaccine page, we obviously have to add in information about COVID-19. So the core 101 Open Pedagogy Project is currently 11 published websites, all focused on societally relevant topics in science, such as climate change and vaccines. We're also currently developing a 12th website for ecology and biodiversity to add at the end of the semester. During each semester, students review the website as it currently exists, identifies areas where the content needs to be added or updated, and areas that need major revision. This is a renewable website. So when my first group of students finished their websites, the next semester, those students picked the websites up where they left off and just continued adding to them. Each website is actually in a different level of development. For example, our space exploration page, it has 42 student authors over 8 semesters and 12 sections of the course. I've put it into semi-retired status because at this point, it's still being used as a resource in the class when we discuss space exploration, but the website itself was getting a little unwieldy as an introductory resource. A lot of the content that students are interested in had already been added. And to add much more, we would have to dive deeper into the science and maybe push it past the level that introductory students could understand. Last semester, a group of my honors students smoothed out a lot of the major edits needed in the space page, and we decided to give the website a break from editing. At the same time, we have, like I said, a brand new website that's being developed as we speak by a group of students in one of my honors courses this semester. And some of the websites have only existed for 2 or 3 semesters. Others have existed since the beginning. Some topics are definitely more popular than others. Space is definitely one of those. Space was edited every semester since the beginning of the project. Same with my ocean page, which is relatively new, but is still very popular as a topic. The best part about these projects is that I say that I put the space exploration page into semi-retirement, and I say it's semi-retirement because space exploration is going to keep changing. And that's the best part of these projects because we can update them with current events. Every semester, there are events that happen that are relevant to our website topics. For example, here, the semester, this page was updated. This is our DNA page. We read an article about the first ever CRISPR gene surgery that could help cure genetic blindness. It had literally just happened. The students thought it was interesting and relevant, and so they included it. Other examples include climate-related events, such as Texas winter storm last February, which prompted in addition to how the polar vortex is impacted by climate change, as well as various wildfire events that have happened over the past few years. And then obviously another very important example on the vaccine page, this update here with the COVID-19 booster shot was added last semester as booster shots and vaccines for children over age 5 were being added to the public discourse. And so this vaccine page has had a lot of edits in the past 2 years to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted the vaccine discussion, and especially because the COVID-19 vaccines are brand new mRNA vaccine technology that hasn't been used in the public. There's a question in the chat, and I don't mind answering it. How do I determine what topics to develop websites around? Is it student-driven? The original websites were topics that I had covered in the class before. They were topics that students had always been interested in prior to the class. And I now today, my students vote for the topics that we cover in the class. And so I assure that, if we're talking about space and vaccines and DNA, there's groups that are editing those websites as we go through the semester. And the level of audience that the students aim for are their peers. They are writing these for future Core 101 students. These websites are given to my students. They're the very first resource every week. So like I do a week on climate change, the very first resource that they're given is the Core 101 climate change website. That's another good question. Do the students peer review each other's work? Absolutely, they do. I also go through and do a lot of vetting and making sure that all of their information is correct. Obviously, we don't want to put misinformation on the website, but the students do peer review each other's work as well. So this is a very, it's a very complex project. It's a big project. I dedicate half of my classes to this project. So they're doing a lot of the work in class, a lot of opportunities for feedback, both verbal and written. And there's a lot of opportunities for feedback from each other. So it's not just go out and do this project and come back into class and maybe have 1 or 2 class sessions on the project. It is fully integrated into my class schedule. So I hope that those answered those questions, but I'm happy to revisit them at the end, but I didn't want to forget about them. Another real benefit to these projects is the ability for students to focus on the intersections of science and their interests and other disciplines. For me, one of the most important parts of taking a general education science class is to understand how science is relevant to them. I want them to understand their relationship with science. So every student is going to have a very different relationship to science. And so a few semesters ago, I had a student that was a Latin American studies minor. She had learned about climate change related migration in one of her Latin American studies classes and wanted to explore the other side of it. She wanted to explore the science side of it. So she spent some time looking at some of the climate patterns, especially like El Nino, La Nina oscillations and how those are changing. But the cool thing is she added that science to the website, but she also added the sociological implications onto our website so that students could understand, well, okay, this is the science, but this is the implication to our society. And this was completely student driven. I had never considered adding a section like this. And she came in and was like, I learned about this in my other class and I really want to focus on this. And it was wonderful. Another group of students decided to focus on some of the privacy issues using AI technology in education. This was completely added after we pivoted to online or remote courses because of COVID, and they were interested in understanding some of the surveillance technology that their professors were using when they were proctoring exams or using Turnitin. And so they completely student-led, added this section to the website. And then, of course, it's nice to be able to add issues of equity and social justice into these pages. Going back to the vaccine website, I had students focus on the disparities in vaccination rates in different groups, both because of health coverage, but also because of distrust in the medical establishment. And so on this page, they outline the Tuskegee syphilis study and how the exploitation of African Americans by the medical establishment has shaped African American views of new or experimental treatments, especially right now during the COVID-19 vaccines. So I'm going back to the chat. Ooh, more chat. Research and collaboration with peers, great work. Do you have a model or outline for creating this kind of project that I could share? Kind of. I actually don't use grading rubrics, and I'll talk about why in a minute towards the end. And so it looks like the next question in the chat doesn't really apply because this is for general education science students. So these are not students that are going on to take board certifications or program entrance exams in sciences. I think I answered that. So now I want to talk about this definition of open pedagogy, because this is the one that speaks to me about my experience and practice. Open pedagogy takes OER as a jumping off point for rethinking the relationship between teachers, students, and knowledge. If teachers and students can now modify their textbook and learning materials, we shift the student emphasis to contribution to knowledge as opposed to simple consumption of knowledge. Teachers and students become learners together, and content becomes a dynamic, always changing category with which we engage rather than a stable set of facts to be mastered. And this is where I found my joy. I didn't need to focus on the minutia of facts that I'd always focused on in my science classes. Every single one of my science classes was exams and memorizing things. And I honestly went back and looked at some of my work from my undergraduate degree, and I was reading it and I'd written it. I'd written these answers on a worksheet or on a test, and I literally did not know what it meant at all. And that was my experience in science. And a lot of times we see that experience shape the way that instructors teach their own classes and continue to teach their general education students, even though they don't need to know the minutia of facts. My course objectives for this class are really broad, and they don't include any content-based objectives. My students need to understand how to use the scientific method, and they need to discuss societally and personally relevant topics in science. Those are my two course objectives. This allows me to democratize my classroom by letting students experience science in ways that is relevant to them. And so instead of asking, multiple choice close-ended questions like the one here, which of the following RNA molecules is important to protein synthesis, my students don't need to know that. They don't need to know that little bit of information as general education students, but that's that content knowledge, like consuming that knowledge. But I'm shooting for something called content fluency. And that's highlighted by Sam's comment here that was in his DNA reflection. If you read it, you can see that Sam here has an understanding of what happens to DNA when it is exposed to radiation, knows that mutations happen and that mutations are not good, and then ties it to a conversation that we had about the potential for space exploration and space travel in the future. To me, that's a little bit more valuable than understanding that minutia, that little fact versus a much bigger concept. And it is here that when students have that content fluency, they become more comfortable talking about they become more comfortable talking about science. And now I realize I'm not sure if the volume is going to share on this video, and I meant to test it with Kyle beforehand and I forgot.
When you click on at the top, you'll be able to click on new share. And then the bottom left hand.
Aha, thank you. I'm sorry about that. I just realized it. Okay, let's see if it works. So this is actually where my students started to find joy as well. I have a clip here. It's like a minute and a half, I think, of two of my former students talking about their experience. The two students are Morgan and Ainsley.
Yeah, I really liked the fact that we were building something instead of memorizing something. So the fact that we had to look up and find facts on our own of what we were interested in based on the topic was a lot better than having to memorize something for a test, because once you memorize something, it goes away. A lot of the things that I learned from researching in this class, I'll never forget our conversation on black holes because I was so interested in that. I asked a million questions. I've never had answers about black holes. And that conversation went on for like an entire class. I had a million questions. I came back the next day with more. It just made me more like interested in what was going on.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Ainsley?
Same here. I've never been good with taking tests, so I was very happy that it wasn't going to be a cram all the information in the night before and kind of regurgitate it on an exam. It was more learn it at your own pace, kind of, because a research project like this, you learn it, you digest it, and then you figure out how to put it on there. Also, just learning all the different things that are going on in space. We learned about like surgeries and the research going into doing surgeries in space due to like when an astronaut has a health issue up there, which I didn't even know was possible and is really interesting.
And so those are two of my students talking about, and you can just kind of see as they talk about it that this is not a drudge. This is not boring to them. This is actually really exciting for them. Oh, it's going to play again. I don't want it to.
I teach general.
Sorry. There we go. And so after they find this joy and they find science interesting, I noticed that their confidence was increasing. And so when students find their courses relevant and engaging, it helps boost their confidence. And there's a lot of research into science anxiety in students, especially in general education science classes, because I have students that have taken like 4 or 5 IB or AP science classes in my sections. And then I have some students who had some absolutely traumatic experiences in science classes. And, you know, some of them, and for those in the middle that just like, they like science, they find it interesting, but it's not what they want to do, or they just never really found science interesting all that much. And they have to come in and they have to take a class, a general education science class. They don't really know what to expect. And they're worried about it tanking their GPA if they don't do so well. One of the largest sources of this anxiety is kind of a mismatch in instructor expectations and what the students perceive in the class. And a way in which to mitigate this is to choose a good textbook resource. And that's also really hard to do. Yes, there are textbooks written for non-majors, but they're written by scientists. And it's very difficult to find a textbook that's going to engage students from, those that really, really, really don't like science to those who've taken AP classes. To me, this Open Pedagogy Project shortens that gap between the authors and the reader's knowledge because they're writing for their peers, they're writing for themselves. And so it makes the content a little bit easier and a lot more interesting for them to digest. I started collecting data a couple of semesters ago on self-efficacy and in my classroom. And so I used a survey by McBride et al. And this project, this Open Pedagogy Project, shortens the gap, addresses a lot of the skills in the self-efficacy scale, such as finding reliable information, writing about science, presenting about science. What grade do you think you're going to how confident are you going to get a good grade in this class? And as you can see, when all 10 items in the scale are averaged, the student self-efficacy last fall, in the 26 students that participated in my survey, it increases from the beginning of the course to the end of the course. And you see this in each of the individual scales, as well as the combined self-efficacy. And this has been really joyful for me to see them walk in, be afraid of science, be nervous about science, and then walk out and they're just talking about what they've learned. And it really led me to reframe the narrative of student scholarship. We have had people questioning our work. I was sharing this project in a departmental seminar and someone asked these 2 questions. Do you publish the D work And are you taking into consideration the university's reputation when publishing this work? Both coming from a very deficit perspective. And I can honestly say that like when this question was asked, my immediate thought was, what D work? I don't get very much D work because we spend so much time in the classroom. This is an iterative process. My students get immediate feedback. They get written feedback. For a student to submit D work, I'm not doing what I need to be doing for this project. I have opportunities to connect with them, every other week on this project. So I can get, if somebody falls behind, I can catch them before they fall too far behind. It's a very scaffolded project. It's very involved in the classroom. Like I said, I don't just send my students out to do this work on their own. We're doing it together in the classroom. The next piece of these questions is whether or not non-majors are capable scholars. And I truly believe that they are. Just because they're not scientists doesn't mean that they can't participate in science and they can't participate in content creation for their peers. And third, this is a Renewable website. So if there's incomplete or incorrect information, there's another group of students that I will have next semester that can take the lead on it. I can point them into that direction and say, hey, that really does need to be fixed. Maybe I didn't catch it the previous semester because I am one person. They can. That's what Renewable assignments, that's one of the powerful pieces of Renewable assignments, is that they can be edited and updated as necessary. And information creation is an iterative process, and it is the key component of Renewable assignments such as these. And so now I'm going to give you my last definition of open pedagogy. At its core, the term open pedagogy expresses the aspiration to improve learning processes through more open teaching practices. So I believe open pedagogy encapsulates the theories and the innovative applied strategies that support that aspiration. And then openness can also be conceived of as an attitude or a worldview, which includes making oneself vulnerable, narrating one's own practice, and sharing one's incomplete scholarship openly. I am practicing open pedagogy with you here today, and it has become open pedagogy is a state of mind for me. And this goes back to kind of my personal journey through this. To give you a little bit of background, this was me and my family in 2017, right around the time that I was learning about open pedagogy. And as I looked for this picture, I was struck by the sheer number of activities we did with my daughter at this age. We went to the aquarium, we went to the zoo, we went to Home Depot, building workshops, holidays, family trips. It was just exhausting just looking at, considering I barely have any pictures from like the past 2 years. It's no wonder that I was so tired, because I was also a year and a half from finishing my PhD, although at the time I thought I only had a year left. I had been teaching for 9 years, working at multiple institutions, and most of that time as an adjunct. A freeway flyer, if you will. I was probably teaching 4 or 5 courses, and I was going through the motions. I was really burning out. And so the Roger Williams OER Faculty Fellow Program came up in my life as just at the right time. And I'm going to admit here, honestly, I applied for the OER Faculty Fellows for literally the $500. That was my main impetus for applying for that program. But it ended up being one of the best decisions of my career. It introduced me to our faculty fellow coordinator, Lindsay Gum, who you should follow on Twitter because she's amazing. And she's instrumental in scaffolding information literacy, intellectual property rights, Creative Commons, privacy, authorship, scholarship, all for my students. She comes into my classroom multiple times over the course of the semester to work with my students on these projects. And so working and collaborating with her on that and multiple other projects has been very rewarding. through her and the Faculty Fellows program, I found a community on campus. And so this was what was really important to me as an adjunct. I had been burned by a previous institution in the past with them telling me that they were going to hire me full-time and then not hiring me full-time. And I was feeling very vulnerable and did not want to like engage with people. I was teaching, I was walking in, teaching, leaving. There wasn't a lot of room for community, I didn't think, but this program opened me up to a community on campus. It kind of took me out of my shell that I had, like with the protective shell that I put myself in. And through the program, I was able to make connections to administrators who now support the work that I do, which is completely necessary because I started doing more radical teaching things as I adopted open pedagogy. But I also met other faculty on campus that I would have never engaged with before. Like one of my closest colleagues doing similar work. He's an architecture faculty member. I have no way that there would be nowhere on campus that we would intersect. And so to me, this like opened the door to finding a community of people that are passionate about teaching, passionate about student success. And it kind of gave me my life, like brought me back to life when it came to my work. And I always want to mention this is like, it was really unique because very rarely do professional development opportunities with money attached to them get offered to contingent faculty. And so about a year after I started the program, I was talking about this with Lindsay, and she told me she was asked at first if she wanted adjuncts to be a part of the program. And she was like, yeah, why not? I don't understand. And she didn't know that was really unusual. And so it turned out to be a complete fluke that she was like, give them money. And so this is super important to anybody who's thinking about doing, supporting this work. Part-time faculty want to be better teachers too. Springing from that campus community, I found myself in the middle of the open ed community. This community, both nationally and internationally, is the most welcoming academic community I've ever been a part of. Teaching has always been my primary focus, much to the chagrin of my advisors, my science advisors. All of these communities are spaces where many are welcome, and open pedagogy in this way, the sharing of teaching practices is always happening. The things that I've learned in these spaces has only strengthened my commitment to more equitable teaching practices, and open pedagogy was the door that I went through to become more equitable. And so I don't give exams anymore. I don't plan my lectures. If I do lectures based on questions that my students pose at the beginning of our class sessions, they're very student-centered discussions. I ungrade. I'm more than happy to talk about it elsewhere. And that's why I don't use rubrics. But each and every single one of these choices has been suggested by people from the open pedagogy community. And they've all made teaching more joyful. And I think I have this tweet here from Lindsay Masland for ungrading. And she talks about, I start most of my audio feedback with, oh my God, here's what I love about your work. And it's joy. All of this makes teaching far more joyful. We're allowed to experience emotions. We're allowed to be happy. To me, that is what makes teaching awesome. But there's a couple of reminders before I wrap up. I cannot do a lot of the work that I do without support, both moral and financial. To the administrators here, pay your adjunct faculty to participate in professional development. Well, invite them in the first place. That's a common problem as well. And support paying them more in general. The average adjunct salary in the United States is $3,500 per course. There's not a lot of incentive to do innovative things in the classroom when you're only getting paid $3,500. advocate for work in open pedagogy and inclusive teaching to count more towards tenure and promotion, and highlight the people on campus doing these things. Next, we're still 2 years into a global pandemic, and some of us are just trying to survive. A lot of my work was done pre-pandemic, and so you're probably looking at this, like, this is ridiculous. Like, how could you imagine doing this right now? And honestly, I don't think I could. But a lot of it was done pre-pandemic, and I found that it was very easy to transition with these equitable teaching practices to that online remote system. I found the transition easier than what I was seeing and reading from others in the community. I can't imagine how I would have taught if I had to give exams online and give lectures. And I just don't think I would have. I think I would have burnt out during this 2 years. And I think now I am burning out, I'm not going to lie. Still finding it anxious, very anxiety ridden, just trying to survive. So maybe this isn't something you can do right now. And that's totally okay. We're under an immense amount of stress. Hopefully there's an end in sight, but maybe this isn't the time to do that. But I hope that you kind of keep it in the back of your mind while you're sitting here today. And then, as highlighted in the Chronicle article that's linked there, inclusive teaching of any kinds affects different individual teachers differently. I'm a white instructor, and with that comes a level of privilege that my colleagues that are not white don't have in the classroom. My authority is very rarely questioned in my classroom space. And that's something that when we're supporting these practices and these changes, we need to keep in mind that not all students are going to respond to different instructors the same way. I was also an adjunct instructor that could only do this work knowing that people supported me. If I did not know that if I had known or not known that my choice to stop grading my students' work would result in me losing my job, I probably wouldn't have done it. But I knew my dean and my administrators above me know what I'm doing, and they support it fully. A lot of adjunct faculty don't have that privilege, or they don't have those connections to know whether or not they have that privilege. And that's why that's why this work is so it's hard to navigate. And I want to recognize that here at the end. And so I'm going to end on this quote. When someone is taught the joy of learning, it becomes a lifelong process that never stops, a process that creates a logical individual. That is the challenge and joy of teaching. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. You can contact me. My email is there, and I love Twitter. So you can absolutely find me on Twitter, DM me, and ask whatever you want.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miceli. Everyone, please give Dr. Miceli a round of applause. Place your emoji in the chat. But thank you, very inspirational, as some quotes were there. But we are open to any questions. We have time for a couple here. If you have any questions, please share those in the chat. While we're waiting for those to come in, our next sessions do begin here shortly. And I believe it's at 1 o'clock, and we'll be ready to go with those. It's going to be student-driven OER, and I wish I would have known lessons learned, right? So some good ones, but we have some questions here.
Yeah, we do. It looks like Shannon asked if I use Google Sites. Yes, I do. So there was a question earlier on if the students have to learn HTML, and they don't. Google Sites is super user-friendly. It only takes like a handful of seconds for me to show my students how to do things, like how to do the basic things. And then they usually kind of take it from there and add more stuff and kind of figure it out from there. But they are using Google Sites. We're at Google University, so we use Google Docs. All of my work is in folders in Google Drive. That's where they submit their work. That way we can peer review each other, leave comments. I can go in and I can see their changes. This semester I have a bunch of honors students revising some of my sites. So they copied the content from the website, put it into a Google Doc, and now we're using the suggesting tool to move stuff around and edit. And it's really powerful to see that work happening because you can actually see it as opposed to in a Word doc later on.
We do have a question in there. Can you pull up your slide again? And they're asking for email and your Twitter account.
Oh, yep, absolutely.
In the chat, or if you can pull up your slide there and share.
I can put it right here.
While you're pulling that up, we have a question coming in. Where can I find more about renewable assignments?
The main person that coined the term renewable assignments is who I cited in my slides. It's David Wiley. And he has a lot of stuff from the 2013 range about renewable assignments. And I can always add it as a link to my Sketch. Actually, I think I linked it in the slide deck, which is in the I put the slide deck in Sketch, so you can access all of the links in there. So David Wiley is the person that started that conversation about renewable assignments, and it's kind of grown from there. And I think Sybil just said there's some ideas on the Open Pedagogy Notebook site, of which I am a contributor, so that there's some information there too. I think there's also a question in the question and answer. How do you talk to your students about the fact that their work will be open? Was it a difficult conversation to have, or were they excited about it? I think it was a really hard conversation the first time because the websites didn't exist and they weren't using them. So I had to explain the whole concept to them. But I get a lot more student buy-in now. My students also have the option, I give them the option of having their full name attached, having a pseudonym, or having them be anonymous. So if you go to the Core 101 site and you scroll down some of the student author pages, you'll see anonymous because students have the option of having their name not attached to their work. I do explain to them that because it's a group project, their work is going to be published online, but so giving them that choice. I've never had anybody ask not to have their work put on the website. I think they're pretty comfortable knowing that it's going to go on, on the internet for students to use, for other people to use. But some of them just don't want their name attached to it, and that's totally fine with me. But yeah, we had a very long conversation about it the very first semester. It's gotten shorter and shorter every semester since, I think because the students see the work, they use the websites as their resources, and so they recognize the value of it. So it doesn't require as much trying to convince them to buy into it.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Miceli, thank you so very much for sharing with our participants, colleagues. I know you've inspired me, and I'm sure you've inspired many of them to rethink what they're doing in the classroom and how it may work in their discipline. So thank you very much for joining us. And participants, our next session starts at 1 o'clock Central Time, or 5 minutes. So thank you again, and have a great day.